Hi, from the University of Delaware in the United States, I'm Kitty Verdolini Abbott. I'm going to be talking about biomechanics and learning in voice, a perfect marriage. Greetings from the waters of Delaware. When I had my first faculty position at the University of Iowa many years ago, at one point, Minoru Hirano, the wonderful Japanese otolaryngologist who taught us so much about the microstructure of the vocal folds, was visiting. And one day he was having a hallway conversation with our equally wonderful Ingo Tietze. And I walked up to them and I said, Minoru, Ingo, as a classical singer, I want to know what is the perfect way to use my vocal folds for singing and for speaking. Is it or is it And I recall that Minoru said the first one. Over time, I became interested in asking that question quantitatively. And that is, how much adduction should we be using to get the best voice? Of course, if we're going to ask that question, we have to first define what we mean by best voice. Most people probably wouldn't articulate this spontaneously, but would probably agree that they want, as a good voice, to have strong voice, which means a clear voice in terms of dB output. Most people don't want to hurt themselves, don't want to have injury when they're using their voice, which we can understand in terms of perpendicular impact stress, or SI, between the vocal folds and phonation, which is argued reasonably so to be the primary cause of injury to the vocal folds from phonation or phonotrauma. And most people would probably say that they want voice to be easy. They don't want to fatigue, which we can understand at least partially in terms of respiratory effort or subglottic pressure required to oscillate, to vibrate the vocal folds and make voice. So we can ask the question, what amount of adduction can we use, controlling for all other parameters, to get the best dB output? What amount of adduction can we use to relatively minimize impact stress between the vocal folds and phonation? And what amount of adduction can we use to relatively minimize subglottic pressure in phonation? We did a series of experiments to address these questions. First author was Dave Barry in 2001, and I think the findings are still relevant. We found that for the point vowels I, E, and U, and presumably for all the vowels in that vowel space, we get the best dB output, controlling in this case for subglottic pressure and fundamental frequency. The best dB output is obtained when the vocal folds are barely touching, about 0 millimeters of separation between the vocal processes during phonation. Okay? In terms of impact stress, we found that there is a plateau in impact stress, which is relatively minimized when the vocal folds are between 0 and 2 millimeters of separation at the vocal processes. And that is between about and impact stress was about the same in this study. If we tightened up adduction a little bit beyond the 0, and that is when we went into pressed voice, impact stress shot way up. And when the vocal folds were abducted much beyond those 2 millimeters, impact stress did go way down. However, there was a huge loss in intensity. And we could also ask the question, what amount of vocal fold adduction can we use to optimize the relationship between voice output intensity, which is strong, and vocal fold impact intensity, which is small? In other words, how can we use our voice strongly and loudly while at the same time minimizing the risk of injury? And the answer to that question was between about 0 and 1 millimeters of separation at the vocal processes. So, how can we get the best voice in terms of vocal fold adduction? We know what to do to get good dB output, and that is get the vocal folds barely touching, or barely separated. And to minimize the injury potential, and that is minimizing impact stress while still getting good output, again, vocal folds between 0 and 1 millimeters of separation. But what about effort? What about respiratory effort? What amount of adduction should we use to minimize respiratory effort in phonation? Generally in life, when we want three things, we have to choose two of the three. Do you want him rich, good looking, or nice? Usually we can't have all three. But because voice is special, we can have all three of the things that we want for a voice with the same vocal fold configuration, and that is barely touching or barely separated vocal folds in phonation. And that concept is illustrated by this very nice formula proposed by Tietze in 1988. And this formula describes or identifies primary parameters responsible for the subglottic pressure needed to initiate and sustain vocal fold oscillation. Here we're looking at the W parameter, which is the prephonatory width at the vocal processes during phonation. And algebraically, as width goes towards 0, so should the subglottic pressure in phonation be minimized. So, awesome. We can get strong voice, protecting from injury, and minimizing phonatory effort with vocal folds that are barely touching or barely separated. We can see what this looks like in this video. Breathy voice. Way up. So, nice. We can talk about what amount of vocal fold adduction, or what is a good biomechanical target for a lot of people in phonation, whether that is speaking or singing. Now, I will confess that over time, especially over the last year or two, I've started to question the necessity of this target, or the advisability of this target as a sole target. In other words, does best voice always have to mean strongest voice output dB while minimizing from injury and minimizing respiratory effort? What about a person who has spasmodic dysphonia and wants to prolong the benefits of Botox? Or what about a jazz singer that's singing in a different idiom from a classical singer? Or what about the various emotional contents of communication that we have every day? That's a topic for another day. But for now, I think we can land on this barely touching or barely separated vocal fold configuration as a reasonable home base. But then, here comes the dark and stormy night. What about the how? Are we going to walk into the clinic or into the studio and tell people to abduct their vocal folds between 0 and 1 millimeters at the vocal processes? And if we want to toss the semi-occluded vocal tract into the mix, to perhaps position the epiglottis towards the posterior pharyngeal wall while they're at it? I don't think that's going to work. And as a matter of fact, the information that we can get from a library or from a university or from a research lab about biomechanics and biology, the what, the physical target of training, is in a different section of the library, a different domain, a different lab than where we will find information about learning. And that's what we therapists and voice teachers and acting coaches are about. We're about learning. Now, I actually did my PhD in experimental psychology, cognitive science, with an emphasis in perceptual motor learning, and that took me 6 years. So obviously, I can't tell you everything that I know about perceptual motor learning, and what I know is only a fraction of what is known anyway. But I do have a little bit of an acronym here that can help to distill some of what I consider some of the essential concepts. And the acronym is SPA-ELF. So on the next page, if you look down the left-hand side of these little phrases here, these little bullet points, you will see SPAELF. Single focus for the patient. Learning requires attention, and by definition, we can only truly attend to one thing at a time. Single focus for the patient. Perceptual emphasis. I am convinced more and more all the time that perception drives action and perception drives learning. So we're going to have a perceptual emphasis in training. We're going to pay a great deal of attention to detail, especially detail regarding movement outcomes. The kinesiology literature for the past 25 or even 30 years has taught us that counterintuitively, it's best if we can get our learners to pay attention to outcomes rather than biomechanics to optimize learning. Next, the approach needs to be exploratory, not prescriptive. We as voice trainers love prescriptions, don't we? Drop your jaw, move your tongue forward, move your shoulders back, stand up straight, do diaphragmatic abdominal breathing, and don't even get me started on that one. We love these prescriptions, don't we? Unfortunately, the literature, hardcore, robust science tells us that this is wrong. The training needs to be literal. Perceptual motor learning is actually a lot less flexible than we often assume. And so we need to train people in the environments that they will actually encounter in real life to hope for transfer. And these are phonetic environments, acoustic environments, visual environments, emotional environments. And troubleshooting needs to be flexible. Each clinician and each teacher and each coach needs to bring his, her, or their personal tricks, personal personality, personal presence to the task of teaching and learning, because it's that personal presence that ignites the whole thing. And another big surprise. We need to limit feedback. Shh. That's really hard for us, isn't it? And practice needs to be variable in all of these environments and situations that the person we have in front of us will actually encounter in real life. So that is a really, really rapid worldview of a perfect marriage between biomechanics and learning in voice training. Does any of this matter? Well, I hope you will be able to read this study in the near future. This is a study we did comparing Lesak Madsen resonant voice training and Casper Stone confidential flow therapy in 40 adults with phonotrauma. One of the outcome measures, a primary outcome measure, was total score on the Voice Handicap Index, which you see displayed here over time. And what we found was that over time, and especially after that first 1 month data collection point, at 3 months and at 12 months, our subjects continued to improve, even though we didn't see them anymore. Mathematically, what we're looking at right here has been described in numerous learning studies as a learning curve. Both of these programs, although they have slightly different biomechanical targets, utilize the same learning principles based on what we just talked about, and they continued to learn and improve on their own after they were discharged from therapy. Stay tuned. We're going to have more data on this learning business and whether any of it matters for outcomes of voice therapy in the near future. So we cherish voice, let the voice live, and let us be heard. Thank you